The other limitation with Iqbal, I think, is, and again, that's a limitation that I think many post-colonialists have, is that there's little engagement with the economics of colonization. So if you read his books, the focus is on producing texts where linguistics, poetry, metaphor, narrative are important, and I've said why they're so important in Iqbal, because you have to, they're an important part of reconstructing agency. But the problem is that the textual realm, the realm of text, can become conflated with the social and economic realm. And the two things are quite different. And the reason I think that's important is that if you read David Harvey's recent book, The New Imperialism, his book that was published in 2004, his argument is that the new imperialism is another stage in the development of global capitalism. And it's actually a very intricate and interesting argument, and I would recommend that you all read it. He's not even a friend of mine, but anyway, do read it. Which is that, and that kind of need to focus on the economic processes, the underlying economic processes structuring colonialism, is absent in Iqbal's work. That's a big gap in Iqbal's work. And the reason I think it's important here is because the demonization of Islam today, has to be put within the historical context of the development of global capitalism over the past 200 years. Okay, so how not just Muslims but other populations have been demonized in the, if you like, imperialist expansion of global capitalism. And David Harvey is very good on this. He shows why why global capitalism has to demonize certain populations, not just Muslims but other populations. And why, for example, capitalism have to rely to a certain extent on racism. So that's where I think we don't get any help from Iqbal, because he's not really concerned with the underlying economic forces which structure colonialism. And then finally, there's an article by Sylvia Walby called Contested Futures, where she argues that there are contested, we're now in the current situation where there are contested futures and contested forms of modernity in operation. And she suggests that the alternatives to global modernity are two. There's the nationalist, authoritarian, xenophobic alternative, and there's the social democratic alternative. And again, this is a very interesting article. And thinking about the current crisis, the financial crisis, she argues that there are socially democratic ways out of the crisis. And I just want to end by thinking about whether there's some aspects of Iqbal which can be used to ground socially democratic, even socialist ways out of the current financial crisis. And I think it's important to remember that the current financial crisis is linked to the intervention in Iraq. And David Harvey, to my mind, makes a very strong argument for the crisis in capitalism in Europe and America is linked to the intervention in Iraq. So what she, I just thought I'd end by talking about Hamid Inayat's very interesting book that he wrote almost 20 years ago called Modern Islamic Political Thought, 1982, where he actually calls attention to socialist and democratic versions of Islam. Now, what these versions of Islam, democratic and socialist versions of Islam, have in common with Iqbal is they have the same, if you like, methodology, which is they are eclectic, so they're cosmopolitan and eclectic. They fuse together what you might call modern concepts with Islamic categories, which is exactly what Iqbal did. So in some senses, Iqbal's style of thinking can ground and characterize new socially democratic versions of Islam. And it's interesting to note here that Ali Shariati, who's discussed in detail by Inayat, also mixed Islamic ideals of social justice with, if you like, dialectical approaches to history. And also, very interestingly, like Iqbal, he focused on the concept of Tawheed, the unity of God, and read it not just as a theological concept, but also as a political and social category. So there are, these important links between them, both in the style of thinking and in the focus on Tawheed, the rereading of theological concepts as political and social concepts. So while there's if you like, a lack of detailed content of social and political thought in Iqbal's work, there is nonetheless the groundwork in the style of thinking which can be extended to reconstruct Islam in terms of socially democratic pathways. And I use the word pathways because of the emphasis on travel and routes and directions in Iqbal. And that, I think, is why, you see, Iqbal also needs to be de-ghettoized, and he needs to be made important to, he's as important to non-Muslims as Muslims. And again, we can think about this. Why has he been incarcerated as a Muslim thinker alone? Because it seems to me that, one thinker, Susan Buck-Moores, has written a book called Thinking Past Terror, which is partly about Islam. And it seems to me that you can bring Iqbal's Islamism together with a Western critical theory to construct a kind of cosmopolitan critical idiom, a cosmopolitan critical framework, which is a response not to just colonial modernity, but also to what Hart and Negri call contemporary empire, and what Harvey calls the new imperialism. Okay, that's enough.